Good afternoon, everybody. Good afternoon. I'm Nick Burns, Executive Director of the Aspen Security Forum. It's a pleasure to welcome all of you to Greenwald 10. A real pleasure to welcome someone I've known for quite a long time, Admiral Phil Davidson, who's commander of our Indo-Pacific Command. I'm going to say a word about Admiral Davidson in a minute, but I just wanted to, there's so many VIPs here, but in the front row, my close friend, in many ways, my mentor at Harvard and our co-chair of the Aspen Security Forum, Professor Joe Nye, is here. I want to thank Professor Nye for his leadership today. And then two very important members of the Aspen Security Group and Forum, Secretary of State Madeleine Albright, who just spoke, I thought, beautifully, passionately about democracy over in Dorhoesier, and Tom Pritzker, who's been an incredibly valuable member of our group who also spoke this morning. So thank you all. Thank you, Elliot Gerson, for your leadership of the Aspen Institute. We're going to have a fascinating discussion today with one of the most important military commanders in the United States, and someone who I think is in the most important region of the world for the United States. That's Admiral Davidson, and that's the Indo-Pacific. Let me tell you a little bit about him. He's from the Midwest, from St. Louis originally, although he has a lot of family history up in the Adirondacks of New York State. He's a 1982 graduate of the United States Naval Academy at Annapolis. He's also a graduate of a school that's close to my home, which is the Naval War College in Newport, Rhode Island. He's had an extraordinary naval career from midshipman to admiral. He has been on frigates. He has been on cruisers. He has been on aircraft carriers. He's had a NATO command. He's commanded the 6th Fleet. He's had important staff positions in Washington. And now he is our commander in this vast region. And we're hoping that we'll be able to pull some maps up in a minute, that it basically extends from South Asia all the way across the Arabian Sea, the subcontinent, the Bay of Bengal, the Strait of Malacca, the Western Pacific, all of the Pacific Ocean, all the way over to Washington, Oregon, California, Alaska, to the north to the United States. I said to Admiral Davidson just now that Robert Kaplan, who's a friend of ours, wrote a great 2011 book called Monsoon, and Kaplan says in that book, this is the strategic power map of the world, Admiral Davidson's command. It's where the 4 strongest military powers in the world are today. And that's Russia and China, the United States, and Japan, and I'll name a 5th, India. It's where 50% of the energy of the world is trafficked. There we go. From the Arabian Peninsula to the big Asian economies. It's where 60% of the container traffic in the world swings east-west and west-east. And it's the future of power, as Professor Nye and others were saying today. So, Admiral Davidson, I thought we'd start with just your command, newly named Indo-Pacific.
Right.
This is the power map. This is a big responsibility. How do you see the major challenges you face?
Well, thank you very much, Ambassador. It's a great pleasure to see you again and see so many DVs and VIPs in the front. To everybody that attends the Aspen Strategy Forum, thank you for your service, adding to the discourse of the national security in the United States, homeland security as well. It's appreciated really by everyone. And my own observation of panels earlier today was extraordinarily helpful to me. If I could just talk about the area of responsibility for a second. My predecessor had a short soundbite for it. The area of responsibility for Pacific Command, now Indo-Pacific Command, extends from Hollywood to Bollywood and polar bears to penguins. So I'm appropriating that myself to describe that. It's indeed just slightly over half the Earth's surface. And if I were to stand up and draw a circle kind of centered on Vietnam, but encompassing China, India, and Indonesia, and the Philippines and up, more than half the Earth's population lives in that circle. Oftentimes when you see the map, if you just pull that up a little bit, when you're looking at Southeast Asia, you think, oh, this is just a small corner of the world. It's actually, huge. In terms of population. It's growing in economic strength. Well over half the globe's wealth is in that area. And when we look at the totality of the whole of the area responsibility, 7 of the 10 largest militaries in the world are in the Indo-Pacific region. The name was recast when I took command just a little over a year ago in Honolulu. It was actually announced by then Secretary Mattis at the change of command ceremony in which I was there. It does not include a change in the area of responsibility, but it does more accurately describe the area of responsibility and the important linkage that the Indian Ocean and the Pacific and the countries around it are to each other through that all-important passageway, which is the Strait of Malacca. I can tell you, everybody in the area of responsibility loves the name Indo-Pacific, except China.
And the Indians really love it.
Yeah, the Indians really love it, and Nepal is another outlier as well. My command, I'm actually the joint commander, so I command Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine, and Special Operation Forces in the Pacific. In total, we have about 85,000 of those people forward, about 28,500 in Korea, about 58,000 forward stationed in Japan. We have numbered air forces, 3-star led Air Force components in Korea and Japan. We have the 7th Fleet home ported in Japan as well. We have the 3rd Marine Expeditionary Force headquartered in Okinawa. You have elements of 1st Army Corps forward in Japan, but most of them are back in the state of Washington. And of course, in Hawaii itself are the 4-star commanders of Pacific Fleet, of Pacific Air Forces, of U.S. Army Forces Pacific, and then the 3-star commander that is Marine Forces Pacific as well. We have small bases in Singapore. We have a major base in Guam, U.S. territory. Whenever you travel to Guam, they remind you this is where America's day begins. It's just on the other side of the international date line. Anderson Air Force Base is there, and Guam is a place that's growing in population going forward. I'm leaving out the almost 300,000 people that are in Hawaii, the continental United States, and Alaska as well. But they're all part of those forces. If I could just comment on the challenges for a minute. 5 major challenges, 4 of which are really articulated in the nation's national security strategy and the national defense strategy. First, and always on my mind day in and day out, is the most immediate threat, which remains North Korea. And we'll come back and talk to that a little bit later. What I consider to be the greatest long-term strategic threat to the United States and the rules-based international order, which is China. Russia has elements in the Pacific at the top of the area of responsibility there. There is an ongoing counterterrorism fight going on within the Pacific Command AOR, which the U.S. Indo-Pacific Command and Special Operations Forces Pacific specifically provides extensive support in the Philippines. And of course, you know, you've all been witness to the Easter attack in Sri Lanka earlier this year. And then there's the threat of man-made and natural disasters across the region, something that takes a considerable amount of time for the headquarters to support not only U.S. territories, Hawaii, our allies in the region, but many of the nations that might ask for help in typhoons, earthquakes, volcano eruptions, things like that. And it's quite busy.
Let me just, we're going to talk a lot about China, obviously. We've had a day focused on China. I want to talk about Japan first. Mm-hmm. I worked for Secretary of State George Shultz 30 years ago. He used to tell us, he was very much oriented towards the Pacific, there is no more important American ally in the world than Japan. Joe Nye essentially said the same thing today on the Great Power panel. We have tremendous forces located there. We have a very tight defense treaty. And obviously, if we're thinking about working with China, but limiting China's strategic ambitions, it starts with Japan.
It does indeed start with Japan. And I would say not only is Japan our most important ally in the region, they might be indeed our most important ally on the globe. I spend more time talking with my counterpart, the Chief of Defense in Japan, Admiral Kawano, and now General Yamazaki, than I do any U.S. commander of my peers in the U.S. Armed Forces. We closely collaborate on just about all issues throughout the Indo-Pacific region. Of course, there is the root of it, which is our obligation under our defense treaty to help Japan. We have bilateral planning efforts that go on there, but we have multilateral efforts and engagements with other nations in the AOR. And we spend quite a bit of time talking about the security, of course, in the Korean Peninsula, certainly in the East China Sea, the South China Sea, across all of Oceania as well, and in the Indo-Pacific.
And America's strategic place in the Indo-Pacific, our predominance as we call it, really begins on September 2nd, 1945. That's the date of the Japanese surrender. The United States stayed in the region. We have a defense treaty with Japan that I think goes back to 1949, 1950, something like that. Our allies system with Japan, South Korea, Australia, defense agreements with the Philippines and Thailand, that's the basis of our power in the Indo-Pacific.
Absolutely. I remind people in the region quite frequently that one of our oldest treaties in the United States was actually with Thailand. It goes back to 1833 and a Treaty of Amity. It speaks to the length of our presence in the Western Pacific, but it also speaks to the reach that we had way back to the beginnings of our own republic. Those 5 treaty alliances is where I have obligations, either defensive obligations or collaboration and coordination obligations going forward. They are 5 critically important countries, when you really lay out the geography of it all, that kind of knit together the Pacific with the Indo-Pacific, and take the lion's share of my responsibilities, my time to service those responsibilities.
So for every administration since President Truman's administration, we've been the most significant military power. We've been safeguarding the flow of commercial goods, of energy. We've been keeping the peace. Is that now at some risk, given the threat from China? What is the threat? That they're going to build up their own military to compete with ours in this region. That they could even possibly gain a technological edge as they militarize AI and quantum computing and biotechnology. We spent a lot of time on that subject here last summer. Is that the most straightforward, most direct risk that we face in the next 10 to 15 years?
I think since the end of the Cold War, it's the most important strategic risk that we bear. One of the fallacies, myths that I think people have is that the size of armed forces around the world have been static through the 21st century. That does not explain the explosive growth in Navy, Air Force, space, and cyber capabilities and capacity. Military speak, capabilities is 21st century improved technology. Capacity is numbers of ships, aircraft, missiles, things like that. It has grown dramatically in China. And without really extant threat, certainly from any of the seaborne nations during that time frame. If I could give you just one descriptor of how dramatically it's changed, at the turn of the century, 2000, China had about 24 satellites total. This year, they will launch more satellites than any other nation on the planet, including the United States, and it will number 100. And it starts to explain to you, the extent at which they are expanding their capabilities. They are embarked on global deployments. It's pretty common knowledge that they have a small naval task force up near the Gulf of Aden off the coast of Africa, in a counter-piracy effort, an independent counter-piracy effort that they're running. They have a base in Djibouti. But more extensively, they are sending maritime and air forces around the world to the extent that they have made more port visits and more continents on the planet in the last 28 months than they did in the previous 28 years. This is describing to you the change that is taking place in the area. It's not a status quo concern.
The great leader of Singapore, the late Lee Kuan Yew, used to say he didn't believe at the end of his life, and he knew both countries very well, China and the United States. He did not believe that China was seeking to become the greatest global power. He said, but it's certain that China wants to be the most significant military power in the Indo-Pacific. So how would they attain that? And how can we do what we want, and that's maintain American strategic power and predominance?
Yeah. To the first part, China is moving quite perniciously across the whole of the Indo-Pacific, if not the globe. Some of this you've seen described in the One Belt, One Road initiative, what they call now the One Belt, One Road, what they call now, only in English, not in Mandarin, the Belt and Road Initiative. It's a very opaque development process that does not use World Trade Organization or any kind of World Bank standards there. It's been marked by corruption, and it's been well articulated by the Vice President, Secretary Pompeo, myself, others. The debt trap diplomacy swap, or excuse me, the debt trap swap that has occurred over time. They had their first Belt and Road Forum a couple of years ago. The pushback in the region on this very opaque process has manifested itself either in direct investigations internal to countries like the Maldives. Malaysia actually pushed back on deals that a previous administration had made, all the way to the point that the second Belt and Road Forum, known as the BARF in my headquarters.
Never heard that before. Is that an internal kind of Navy thing?
Yeah. Known as the BARF in my headquarters was just in the last couple of months. They had to spend considerable time trying to convince those attendees that the bad practices that had been extant in the years gone by were not going to be part of the process going forward. There are other examples of pernicious behaviors, including, for example, last year when Australia was just debating improving their foreign investment laws, similar to our CFIUS laws in this country. While it was in debate, magically, Australian beef and wine, the major place where it goes from Australia is China. Their number one train began to stack up on the loading docks. So you can see how China is connecting, do what I ask, or we won't do what you desire in response coming back. The pushback is in the region. The good thing I like to talk about is there's been a general convergence now around the idea of a free and open Indo-Pacific. President Trump in Vietnam in the fall of 2017 announced this vision. I think you saw Secretary Pompeo build on this at the Pacific Business Forum last summer. Vice President Pence's speech at the Hudson Institute and then at APEC in Papua New Guinea last fall in 2018, are starting to expand this vision. Japan has a very similar vision. Prime Minister Modi at the Shangri-La Dialogue in Singapore a year ago put forth a similar vision. Australia has a strategic vision that's quite similar. Even New Zealand last year put together a very clear-eyed document that spoke to this. And as ongoing right now, Indonesia is leading an effort within ASEAN to describe a free and open and inclusive Pacific. This is all goodness. I'm seeing a general convergence and support in the military space, and I think the United States is actually seeing support in the diplomatic and economic space from these nations and others. There are other strategic opportunities across the area of responsibility to help in this regard.
So part of your job is to be a diplomat. I mean, you and the U.S. Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia, I'm not even sure that job is filled right now.
It is?
It is filled now.
Yeah, Assistant Secretary Dave Stillwell. He's been there just a few weeks.
So the two of you are the two senior officials outside the Secretaries of State and Defense and the President and Vice President who are managing our relationship with these countries.
Certainly Randy Shriver in the Department of Defense as well, the Assistant Secretary there. So, yeah.
But you travel a lot.
I do spend quite a bit of time in the area of responsibilities. Allies, absolutely, advancing those relationships. But speaking of the Hollywood to Bollywood, I've been as far as India, all the way down to New Zealand already in the first year. So.
Let's talk about two places where we're competing with China. The first, maybe we can pull the map up. The first is the South China Sea. There are 6 claimants to the Spratly and Paracel Islands. China's one of them. Every country owns 12 nautical miles out under the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, but you don't own beyond that. China's pushed several hundred nautical miles out. They've effectively militarized these islands. The United States and our allies have countered by these freedom of navigation exercises. You take American and other vessels through these disputed waters, which we believe are international waters, to prove the point that it's not a Chinese lake. I know why you do it, and you're right to do it. What are the risks in doing that, and how do you manage those risks?
Certainly. The United States itself has long had freedom of navigation operation policy to enforce the United Nations Convention on the Law of the Sea, really decades, if not centuries, of maritime practice and law. To be frank and fair, the United States has run a more assertive program than any other nation on the planet and always has. It is not a new posture or policy for the United States. We do it all over the globe. I tell people quite frequently, we run freedom of navigation operations on Canada because the United States and Canada have conflicts in the maritime and claims, conflicting claims, in areas in which we have near territory. We've been running freedom of navigation operations in the South China Sea to assert not U.S. claims to these waters or assert a U.S. position other than the international position that these disputes should be resolved peacefully, and then we assert, the mode of operation that the Convention of Law on the Sea dictates military ships would operate. Again, there are multiple nations down there with claims. We don't do these freedom of navigation operations against China. It's really as demonstrations to all those nations that are indeed down there. Now, I would tell you, China protests these claims most vehemently. We rarely get a protest from any of those other nations down there. And in fact, many of the nations support our freedom of navigation operations quite strongly. I would tell you right off that Vietnam is the most vocal.
And they're one of the claimants in the Paracels.
And they are one of the claimants in the Paracels, no doubt about it. During the course of the last year, however, we have been able to garner more international support with operations, perhaps not freedom of navigation operations as we define them and conduct them, but certainly operations within the 9-dash line, a large area in the South China Sea that China claims as their own. Nations like Japan, Australia, Canada, the UK, France have all conducted operations either independently or with the United States or with others, and I would add India and some other nations to this as well, to demonstrate that this is international water and to demonstrate really how critical the South China Sea is. One of the things we didn't talk about was, that critical waterway and what it means. $3 trillion in goods traverse that waterway aboard ships each and every year.
Yeah, the Strait of Malacca.
From the Strait of Malacca, in the South China Sea, between Vietnam and the Philippine Sea, up south and either head to Japan, heads to China certainly, heads to Korea, heads to the United States and Canada as well, indeed all the way over to South America. What's frequently left unsaid is the collection of underwater cables, internet, telephone, that traverse the South China Sea. Cables follow civilization. Many of them terminate in Singapore, spread through the South China Sea from there, and of course, again, terminate in the kind of same places I just described. Trillions of dollars of financial information, trillions, or not trillions, but highly detailed telecommunications information travels on those cables throughout the world. So the freedom of navigation operations is not about two destroyers passing safely in the night. This is about the world's access to the most critical waterway on the planet in order to facilitate global trade, communication, financial flows, so critical to everybody's peace and prosperity.
Right, and to its credit, the Trump administration, as the Obama and George W. Bush administrations, has been conducting these exercises to demonstrate our commitment to international safe passage. The Chinese don't like it. Chinese ships shadow yours.
Yes.
What are the risks of a conflict?
Yeah.
That ships could collide, there could be a misunderstanding.
Yeah.
Do you let the Chinese know ahead of time where the ships are going and when they're going?
Yeah. No, we don't generally let ships know where we're going or when we're going. Excuse me. Other nations know where we're going and when we're going. There is a code agreed to between China and the United States and many other nations called the Code for Unplanned Encounters at Sea, which describes the communications that would transpire between two ships when meeting on the high seas. As I intimated before, Chinese ships have grown exponentially over the course of the 21st century here. we interact with those ships really around the globe. It's true, they shadow our ships whenever we're operating within the East China Sea or the South China Sea. They shadow many nations' ships when they're operating in the East China Sea and South China Sea. So the tactical communications is happening ship to ship, ship to aircraft in the region, in English, in accordance with this code. The rules of the road, as all agreed to by UNCLOS and the Colo regs, the international code for ships' conduct when they're in sight of each other, is extant and keeps the risk fairly low. I would tell you the vast, vast majority, way up in the 99th percentile, of all these encounters are safe
routine
and professional and routine. The unsafe, unprofessional ones make the news and tend to continue in the news whatsoever, but I actually think the risk for miscalculation is somewhat low.
And we have decent ship-to-ship communications between Chinese officers and American officers.
We do.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So the risk of the probability of a conflict is quite low.
Over freedom of navigation operation, absolutely.
If you could put the map up again, you've been dealing with this crisis in the South China Sea, as your predecessors did. There's also a crisis in the East China Sea, south of the Japanese home islands, where the Japanese have administrative control over the Senkaku Islands. Chinese call them the Diaoyu Islands. The United States recognizes that because we transferred these islands to Japan in 1972. We had administrative control from the Second World War, from 1945. President Obama was very clear in March 2014 that in the event of a conflict between Japan and China over the uninhabited Senkaku Diaoyu Islands, the U.S.-Japan Defense Treaty would be in force.
Yes.
Is that clear to the Chinese? Is that is this a stable reason right now?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, the document itself, the treaty itself, makes specific mention of islands under features under administrative control of Japan. And then, as you said, President Obama's further clarification of that is well known across the region. We have bilateral planning responsibilities. Japan, the United States, my headquarters is key to that, and a routine rhythm in which we review those plans with Japan. And I can tell you in the last 5 years that planning and the clarity and transparency between the two allies, Japan and U.S., has never been better.
Yeah. Over the long term, the Chinese are building a blue water navy. They're developing potent ballistic missiles designed to push your carrier task forces away from the South China Sea, way out into the Pacific towards Guam. How do we have effective countermeasures to that? That's a big, great game power struggle underway right now between the two nations.
Yeah. The nature of warfare has always been about offense, counters, counter, and moving forward. While certainly they are developing capability that we have not seen before. Anti-ship ballistic missiles is the newest one. These are not monoliths that cannot be defeated. And when I talk to the department at the Pentagon, make our requirements known, I can tell you that the conversation that we have is very focused on the capabilities and the capacities that we need to handle such threats now and in the future, and we're going to continue to articulate those things. If I could just make mention for a minute, speaking of China and its long-term strategic threat to the region, the Shangri-La dialogue happens annually in Singapore, right around the 1st of June. For the last several years, China has been actually attending at a rather low level, thinking that they would host their own forums and dominate the conversation there. This year, Minister Wei, their defense minister, gave a speech, which I thought was quite chilling for everyone in the audience. Not only did he make it clear that he didn't think Asia and the Western Pacific was any place for America, he basically said that Asia wasn't even for Asians, it was for the Chinese. Within 24 hours of that, they tested a new nuclear ballistic missile, not in nuclear mode necessarily.
Right.
That was made public somewhat quickly. I would say then, just a couple of weeks ago, Minister Wei again, speaking to a forum of Latin American and Pacific Island defense ministers from Oceania, made it clear that the One Belt, One Road, Belt and Road Initiative to use their term, was indeed a way to put a military foothold in other places around the globe. Within hours of that, they shot 6 anti-ship ballistic missiles, new ones that they have developed, into the South China Sea, the first time they have done an at-sea test. It's, one might be a coincidence, but seeing this happen twice is indeed a message not only to the United States, but indeed the whole of the globe.
I also just want to go back to what the Chinese are doing to build up a new modern technological base. They're investing billions in AI, the militarization of it, machine learning, as we said before, quantum computing. A lot of people fear at our conference here last year that Joe and Madeline and Tom and I attended that the Chinese might be slightly ahead in developing a new generation of military technology. I mean, do you believe in our lifetime? We're still young guys. We could lose our competitive military edge, that China could actually overtake us, that we could become the #2 military power on that map.
No, having a conversation about these technologies now, I think, is critically important. Investing in these as a matter of national security, thinking above the defense plane, I think is critically important to the nation and how we should be thinking about this problem. When I pull down the operational level and all my problems within the military, we're seeing essentially China surpass the capability that Indo-Pacific Command commands and controls in the area of responsibility I described earlier in numbers here in the next couple of years. And that capability in terms of just what we see, air, maritime, land, space, cyber, we run the risk, if we don't take proactive action, that China will indeed surpass our capabilities by the middle of this next decade.
So this might be the single most important decision we have to make in American foreign policy, that we're not going to lose our military edge to the Chinese, because everything else depends on that we want to do.
And absolutely, and it's more than just a tech thing. It's a whole of government approach that has to address these things. This is about education. It's about opportunity. It's about policy positions around the globe, how these new technologies will be treated. Is very, very important.
So, final question on China. We're not enemies. We're rivals, but not enemies. And Washington these days, most Democratic Party politicians and most Republican politicians have swung away from engagement with China to an entirely competitive relationship. And a lot of us have been asking, I asked it here yesterday, Joe referred to it today, a number of people did. For 40 years, we've had a balance of engagement and competition with the Chinese, every president. We seem to be in an entirely competitive mode. Do you worry about that? I mean, we're going to have some kind of relationship with China on the global economy, stabilizing it, on climate change, avoiding war, and so you have to have your level of communication with the Chinese government. Do you worry we're in too competitive a phase with the Chinese right now?
Yeah, I get troubled frequently by some of the things I read in the open media. A very careful reading of the National Defense Strategy, and I can tell you all my dialogues within the department, nobody is talking about confrontation, and nobody is talking about containment. That's frequently dialogue I hear reflected back coming from China, who's trying to shape everybody's perceptions in the region. There's no doubt about it that we've talked about competitive strategy. Competitive does not mean don't engage.
Right.
We do engage at the military level. I painted for you the kind of dialogue that happens at the tactical level. In the theater. There's actually more than that. There's plenty of aircraft-to-aircraft communications that go on as well. We in Indo-Pacific Command, my Army component has an annual exercise on humanitarian assistance and disaster relief with China. Good. Actually, we sent a company plus, 100-odd troops to China earlier this year, and my 4-star component actually went there. There is a formalized military-to-military exchange program. Who goes, and what reciprocal visits will happen in that time frame. The Chief of Navy Operations just had a video teleconference with the PLA Chief of Navy to talk about some of the issues that we've talked about here today. So this is an ongoing dialogue. Could it be improved? Absolutely. The United States has a long-standing request with China for me to have crisis communications with the Southern Theater Commander, who manages the South China Sea, and the Eastern Theater Commander.
Their commander.
Their commanders.
Yeah.
They have yet to respond to that ask. And I make it clear to all my allies and partners in the regions that talk to China that this is a standing ask, and we'd like to see it fulfilled. I think it would reduce the threat of miscalculation, certainly, and I think it would help reduce the idea that there's any kind of confrontation or conflict going on, or containment going on, excuse me.
Thank you. The other major strategic development that's occurred since you and I were junior officers in the military and the State Department is the development of our big strategic relationship with India. On in the air, on the sea, our economic relationship, our political ties, and also the development of a military partnership, Tokyo, Delhi, Washington. I know that no one uses the C word, that we're trying to contain China, but the L word, limit, or M, manage. This is a big initiative that's very much in our interest among the three countries to work together. How's that going in your estimation? How important is that to you?
We talked about Japan as the most important alliance, and then I talked a little bit about the free and open Indo-Pacific. What binds the free and open Indo-Pacific together most importantly, it's not just mutual security concerns. It can't absolutely be everybody's economic interests. It has to be more than that. It includes those values. And when you knit together great democracies like the United States, Japan, and the potential that is the 1.35 billion people in India, I think every great democracy on the planet would like India alongside. Last year, within the Department of Defense realm, we signed a very important agreement that was months, if not years in the making with India, that helps us exchange information and intelligence. It's really a technical agreement. But it allows us, it has allowed us to do some operational collaboration and some planning with India that has opened their eyes and improving our relationship quite quickly, to the point they're telling me now to hurry up. Those of you with experience in India know you seldom get a hurry up call from India. But we're also buying a number of U.S. equipments. India is the largest buyer and the largest possessor of C-17 lift aircraft in the globe besides the United States, and they buy those from the United States.
P-8.
New maritime patrol aircraft, the P-8s, they fly C-130s, Apaches, a new howitzer, that kind of thing. We like to see, U.S. defense equipment there. It helps drive tactics and doctrine together. That would advance our relationship with India greatly. You know, my peers in India, you know, they grew up under Soviet training. Right. And then Russian sustainment for years and years and years. They certainly see the value of the engagements with us and are interested in moving forward with us. Are there rifts in that? You know, certainly there's the issue of S-400 out there. We're still in dialogue with them about that.
The S-400.
India acquiring the S-400. It's a Russian air defense system from Russia. That's a bit of a problem. We continue dialogue. I think they intend to do that. I'm trying to clarify for them the tactical and technical case that's so important here, that like equipments drive together a sense of compatibility and interoperability that really can't be beat. And really, you know, U.S. equipment is outperforming on the globe, and you see this periodically come up against Russia, and U.S. equipment is outperforming. India is quite proud of their non-aligned policy status. They view this discussion about the S-400 as a policy issue and not a tactical and technical one. So we've got a little bit of ways to go there. I tell people all the time, we are on a 10,000-step journey with India, and we're on step 9.
Of 10,000.
Yeah, and you know, this is what alliances are built on. And you just have to get to 10, 11, and 12 and keep working forward. I will tell you, India, Japan, the United States working closely together, not only in the Indian Ocean region, but really in the Western Pacific and throughout Oceania, is welcomed throughout all those areas. India is a key collaborator with Japan and myself. We have an annual maritime exercise, the Malabar exercise, last executed about this time last year, a little bit over that. We're looking to continue to advance those opportunities going forward. We now have some information sharing systems between maritime headquarters, and we are capable now of deploying on an urgent basis tactical communications equipments between maritime patrol aircraft and ships that will help advance our interoperability when it comes to threats under the sea, on the sea, and above the sea in the Indian Ocean going forward.
I was in Delhi last month, and I can tell you the new Modi government that is just taking shape right now deeply values our military relationship. In the old days, 20 years ago, if you'd walk into any office in Delhi, in the Foreign or Defense Ministry, the Prime Minister's office, they'd say, let's talk about Pakistan.
Yeah.
And now it's, let's talk about China. And they perceive that we, the Japanese, the Indians, and Americans, have the same dilemma. We all want to live in peace with China, work with China, and yet not be dominated by China. So they're looking at that. And you've developed personal relationships that came into use this past March when India and Pakistan exchanged fire across the line of control, two nuclear weapons powers. You engaged with the Indian government. Tell us about that.
Yeah, in late February, to help manage the crisis after the initial exchange of fires, the shoot down of aircraft, I made multiple calls to the Chief of Defense, then Admiral Lanba, now been replaced back in the late February timeframe. My counterpart at Central Command, then General Joe Votel, was in close discussion with the Chief of Army Staff within Pakistan to help manage these threats. Certainly the Secretary of Defense and Secretary of State were involved with their counterparts as well. I think in my own assessment and dialogue with Admiral Lanba, I think it helped him raise his confidence that we were interested in their security as keenly as we were interested in Pakistan's security. And we were able to run some things to ground for him to provide some assurance that I think went a long way to help and advance our relationship as well. And we just have to continue to build on things like that.
Thank you. Two more quick questions, and then we'll go to the audience for questions. You and I met in 1993-94 when you were the military aide to Vice President Al Gore, and I was NSC Special Assistant to Vice President Gore and President Clinton. We traveled together to Russia. We were building a big strategic relationship with Russia, with the Yeltsin government that never really managed to pan out. Now you've got to deal with the Russians in your area of responsibility. They've got a lot of territory in the Russian Far East. What kind of a relationship do we have with Russia in the Russian Far East, in the Pacific theater?
The Russian Far East capability is maritime, really, in nature. They have the very latest nuclear ballistic missile submarines, two home-ported there. They have others. And over the course of the next 2 years, they'll be gaining new capability when it comes to frigates and a land attack cruise missile submarine that's quite quiet, called the Severodvinsk. They continue to patrol. They sent a task group across the Pacific just a couple of months ago, actually passing through the EEZ of Hawaii on its way to the Panama Canal, and then has been operating in the Southern Command and the Northern Command ever since. It's on its way to St. Petersburg. That maritime threat, represents an existential threat with those nuclear ballistic missile submarines. And so there's new capability there. Interestingly, last year, and we're seeing it to this day, some increased operational collaboration between Russia and China. So last year, the exercise Vostok, which is mostly a land-based exercise, takes place in eastern Russia there. It included both Russian and Chinese formations, and Russian and Chinese command and control headquarters for those formations. That was the first of its kind on Russian territory. And in just the last couple of weeks, the Russians flew two bombers from the Far East bases around Taiwan and back. They were not demarched by China, and I will tell you, China demarshes everybody else on the planet that does such a thing, which just makes you believe that they had the tacit approval. They had the tacit approval of China, either before execution or during it. I think that that is not an outcome we want, an aligned China and Russia opposing the international order that's espousing these free and open Indo-Pacific, and indeed, the whole of the global order's concerns.
So this is a tall list of challenges that you and your men and women on your command face every day from Honolulu. Last question. In 2017 at this security forum, people were talking about war between the United States and North Korea. Mercifully, we're not talking about that. The president has put us on a diplomatic path. I've supported, obviously a lot of us have supported him meeting Kim Jong-un. No real progress in terms of denuclearization or even identifying the nuclear weapons stockpile, but you've got a part of this in terms of enforcing the sanctions against North Korea. How intensive is that operation right now?
Certainly. Just had a third meeting between the president and KJU there at Panmunjom here just in the last few weeks at the end of the G20 summit. To the point, I would say that tensions are greatly reduced. You are not seeing nuclear testing today, nor are you seeing medium range, intermediate range, intercontinental ballistic missile testing as well. Now, I'm not Pollyannish about this. There's no doubt in my mind that North Korea is continuing to develop nuclear weapons and continuing to develop long-range ballistic missiles to fire them. We had an incident in the May timeframe in which they shot some short-range ballistic missiles. We view those as tests and not a provocation, so to speak. But we have a ways to go here in this negotiation to get to the denuclearized DPRK. My obligations are, one, to support diplomacy. Secondly, is the readiness of the forces on the Korean Peninsula, as well as the readiness of the forces that would come to their aid. One of the, I think, the international triumphs that's going on is the enforcement of UN sanctions to prevent the illicit transfer of refined oils into North Korea and the export of North Korean coal throughout the region.
And that's your responsibility.
Yes.
To track that. And
yes, and so we have an enforcement coordination cell, an international headquarters in Yokosuka, Japan, that the Japanese co-host with us. It's staffed by Japanese, United States, Koreans, South Koreans, Canadians, Australians, New Zealanders, the UK, France has been there as well. Those nations have also periodically provided ships and maritime patrol aircraft to help identify not only the North Korean ships that are receiving this oil, but the feeder networks that are providing it. And it's happening from commercial entities all across the region, different flag states, different business entities that are providing this thing. The transfer of fuels at sea is a quite common practice. There's a lot of legal transfer of fuel going on. It's how shipping companies, ships, avoid port costs in expensive ports that they don't want to go to. So, this is a needle in a stack of needles kind of work, but it's been important. I can tell you Vietnam and Indonesia are helping on the export of coal. Good. Where we're not getting help is China. So China has dozens and dozens of these maritime militia ships operating in the South China Sea to serve Chinese ends when they could be up helping on the denuclearization effort of North Korea and helping monitor these situations that are principally happening in Chinese territorial waters, in their contiguous zone, or up in North Korean waters itself.
And that's a United Nations mandate. Those are UN Security Council resolutions.
Yeah.
China ought to be doing that.
China could be doing much more.
Admiral Davidson, thank you for your service to the United States.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Right here. Questions for Admiral Davidson? We'll go right here. 2 questions. We'll ask them right together in the second row. The mics are going to come right here to this side of the second row. Microphones, please. Oh, thank you.
Thank you. Sherry Goodman at the Woodrow Wilson International Center with Jane Harmon. Thank you, Admiral Davidson, for your service, and thank you, Nick, for your leadership here. One of your predecessors, Admiral Locklear, said that among the most serious threats in the Pacific region is climate change. And you framed it as natural disasters. We have some of the Pacific Island nations could be uninhabitable due to sea level rise in our lifetime, producing the first generation of climate refugees. Many of our allies in the region, like Australia and New Zealand, are already preparing for that eventuality. Extreme weather events and natural disasters also hit the region very hard. You've been supportive through, with New Zealand of the Pacific Environmental Security Forum to address some of these concerns. The French have also been very active in their part of the Pacific. How are you using climate security to support your partnerships and to address the concerns both of increasing Chinese influence in these vulnerable areas and also to help our allies?
Thank you very much for the question and your interest. The Indo-Pacific Command has stepped up our engagements across the Pacific Island chain. This is Micronesia, Melanesia, and Polynesia itself. You know, it's 10 million square miles and about 6 million people. And when I talk to my peers, whether they're military folks, law enforcement folks, or political leadership in these countries, I ask them all the time, can you see the changes extant on the ground on your islands from when you were a boy to today when it comes to climate change? And to a man and woman, they have all said yes. And then in combination with this is the effects of a higher level of storms, and I'll give a description of that here in a minute. Lower level islands, you know, key starch provision is the taro root. It grows in very low areas in many of these places. If it takes a storm surge, whether that's a typhoon or a tsunami, and that gets inundated with salt water, that ground is ruined for decades and becomes a problem to them. We at Indo-Pacific Command, we have a Center for Excellence in Disaster Management. This is a course that we export not only for military folks, but for civilian folks, and we host people certainly in Honolulu as well. We actually export it all around the globe. This is an area in which we're helping advance disaster management skills, both at the political level and at the law enforcement and military level in many of these nations going forward. We actually also provide a lot of direct support. So last year, I'll tell you, we had a 500-year storm in Saipan and Tinian. The existing population did not have the capacity to do much more than take care of their own. So to clear roads, fix roofs, make sure that power and water was fell on actually Title 10, you know, active duty people. We conducted that operation for some 5.5 months. It's in, you know, a Commonwealth of the Northern Marianas. It's actually U.S. FEMA's responsibility to help there. FEMA didn't have the capacity, given other things that was going on the west coast of the United States, nor were they able to contract for it, which is the next level. So Title 10 actually stepped in there. We had hundreds of troops on the ground from all the services for some 5.5 months to help clear debris and fix roofs and do all that kind of thing. We're going to be doing more and more of that. My engagements with political leadership across the Pacific Island chain, one of the things when we talk about development, we talk about development that matters to their future, because the idea that their population may have to leave, I don't think is you know, an effective future for those nations. I would say, I think if China was truly interested in helping in these nations, they would make investments along those lines as opposed to building the largest office building in Fiji or whatever they do.
It's also something we can do with the Chinese if we get into cooperative mode to balance the competition. Yes, right here.
Thank you. Deborah Haynes from Sky News in the UK. On North Korea, the North Koreans have said that they will scupper the efforts to resume dialogue and maybe even resume long-range missile tests if the United States and South Korea take part in military drills. What do you make of that threat, and are those drills going to go ahead? And if you'll allow me a question about something not in your area of responsibility, but as a senior military officer, how likely is it that the crisis between the US and Iran in the Gulf is going to end in conflict? And do you believe that efforts...
Can I answer that question for you?
Do you believe that the suggestion by Donald Trump that countries like China and Japan that rely so heavily on tanker traffic through the Strait of Hormuz will actually get behind his desire to build a coalition of militaries to help escort tankers there? Thank you.
Thank you.
I made comment about the responsibility to support diplomacy and provide for the readiness of our forces in Korea. We run 2 major exercises a year on the peninsula, February and the August timeframe. I can tell you my orders are to execute that exercise in August. And I'll say this about North Koreans' rhetoric. They have neither lowered nor raised their own exercise profile from before this negotiation as well, so they have little to complain about. To the second point, I'm not going to comment on Iran. That's the business of the Central Command Commander and the national leadership here of the country. I will say this about international waterways. These are not great power issues. These are international order and the rights that everybody has come to over years of maritime practice and law and agreed to under UNCLOS to have access to these places. It's not solely the United States' responsibility to enforce the international sea and airspace. It is indeed the responsibility of all nations to do that. The United States approach, and what we've been talking about in the free and Indo-Pacific, is the seas and airways are the important areas that bind us together. Others, Iran, China, other dialogues, they use these areas as barriers that they want to close off. That's not the kind of international order and free and open Indo-Pacific that we want.
Thank you. Let's take a question from over here. Yes, right here.
Numerous senior pilots from the Navy have been reporting significant UFO activity.
You take questions on UFOs, Admiral?
There's a reporting process for that and an office that handles that. And it was happening over a pretty finite period of time several years ago. I'll leave it at that.
Let's go from the left wing of the audience to the right wing, over here. All the way in the back. There's an advantage for sitting in the very back row of the entire Greenwald tent. And the mic's coming right to you.
Hello. Thank you for doing this. I'm Kathy Gilstam with The Atlantic. I'm also from St. Louis, so we could talk later about where you went to high school and go Blues. Given the dynamics you described and the potential risk of China overtaking the United States in capabilities within the next couple of years, you said, are you at all worried about, to get back to the Iran question, are you at all worried about the shift of resources to the CENTCOM area of responsibility and what that does to the requirement for Indo-PACOM to build up as well?
Yeah, no, Secretary Mattis made it quite clear in public and certainly in private to me that the Indo-Pacific theater was the priority theater. And I think if you watched Secretary Esper's testimony just this past week, he affirmed that as well. I'm not concerned about the resources right now. Give me the second question again. That was it?
China's
okay,
qualitative military edge. I think she referred to that. Yeah. Okay. Yes, sir. Right in the back here in the blue shirt. If you can stand up, the mic's going to come right down to you. Why don't we do this? Why don't you ask your question and you ask your question, and we'll make those the last two questions. Okay.
So, question about the Philippines. Has Duterte's apparent turn closer to China affected any of your operations at all?
I'm sorry, can you say that one more time?
Sure. Has Duterte's apparent turn towards China affected your operations at all?
It's one of the things we didn't talk about in depth was the counter-terror advise and assist mission that we've had ongoing for the Philippines now for almost 20 years. I can tell you in the wake of the fight in Marawi in 2017, in which the Armed Forces of the Philippines and the Philippine National Police Force, Special Action Forces, fought incredibly bravely. And I tell you, this is no village. Marawi is a city of 200,000 people. And the U.S. assistance provided to that energized the military-to-military relationship in a way that hadn't been extant probably over the course of the previous decade. I have bilateral planning efforts with my counterpart, General Madrigal. General Madrigal was in my headquarters here earlier this week, Monday and Tuesday, for a counterpart visit and for us to speak about these issues. So our coordination and collaboration is quite close. We also have a trilateral planning effort that has just begun here in the February timeframe between Japan, the Philippines, and us to worry about concerns wider than just those individual nation securities, but wider across the Indo-Pacific. So I feel well supported at the military level there. And I think Secretary Pompeo's clarification of the mutual defense treaty we have with the Philippines in the February timeframe has gone a long way to improving that relationship. So the United States is in extraordinarily high standing with the Philippine populace and most of the political apparatus there, and I take a little worry from that.
Please.
Thank you, sir. Steve Shapiro with the Atlantic Council in Bend. You've made a few references to the importance of UNCLOS, the Law of the Sea Treaty. Of course, the United States hasn't ratified the Law of the Sea Treaty. So my two-part question, the first is, does that hamper your work in any way, the fact that we haven't ratified? And if the answer is no, because essentially it's become international law, which the U.S. has accepted, might that have future implications for things like the Paris Climate Treaty?
Yeah, to the point about UNCLOS, I mean, the U.S. conduct has always been, when it comes to military operations, freedom of navigation, has always been in accordance with UNCLOS. That was something that President Reagan and his administration made clear that we would follow, and we have ever since that time frame. Every senior naval officer in the United States has advocated for, and I'm on the record during my confirmation hearing as saying that ratification UNCLOS would be a good thing for the United States.
Has it hindered your work in any way?
No, I don't think so.
So my takeaways from this session, Admiral, from the conversation are that you have this extraordinary breadth of responsibility, not just geographic, in our most important strategic command, but also the incredible number of things that you do, from typhoon assistance to counterterrorism to being the critical force in trying to manage the return of China to power in the Indo-Pacific. The incredible competence of the United States military, the importance of our allies, and the importance of having great soldier statesmen, sailor statesmen. So thank you for what you are doing for our country. We appreciate it.
Thank you.
Great.